Imagine a single invention lighting up villages, powering schools, and reawakening the dreams of young engineers across an entire continent. Now, imagine that spark didn't come from Silicon Valley, but from a modest workshop in Zimbabwe. For years, Africa's energy crisis has been treated like an impossible puzzle: unreliable grids, expensive fuel, chronic blackouts, and rural communities waiting decades just to join the modern world. But something unusual began happening around 2017. Online forums, engineering WhatsApp groups, and independent maker communities started buzzing with one name: Maxwell Chikumbutso. Videos of unconventional generators, self-powered vehicles, off-grid systems, and prototype drones began circulating. And while the world argued whether these machines were revolutionary or simply misunderstood, young African innovators were quietly taking notes. They weren't focused on the debates, they were focused on the possibilities. Because for the first time, someone on their own continent was demonstrating that breakthrough energy solutions didn't have to come from billion-dollar labs, PhD teams, or Western corporations. They could come from resourcefulness, improvisation, and relentless experimentation. In Lagos, small tech hubs began hosting alternative energy nights. In Nairobi, university engineering students started building microgenerators using scrap electronics. In Ghana, startup incubators began offering grants for clean rural electrification projects. None of this was happening before, and yet now it was accelerating. As one Kenyan student put it during a local robotics meetup, "If Maxwell can build it from nothing, what excuse do we have?" Suddenly, Africa's energy conversation shifted from waiting for foreign aid to building homegrown solutions. But it wasn't just hardware. Something deeper awakened: belief. Young engineers started asking better questions. How do we store energy without expensive batteries? How do we power homes without diesel? How do we stabilize rural grids using cheap components? Across the continent, labs that once focused on mobile apps began experimenting with inverters, magnetic induction systems, solar hybrids, and kinetic microgenerators. This shift did not go unnoticed. Investors from South Africa, Morocco, and even the Gulf states began scouting for African energy startups. Clean tech forums that once had empty chairs were now standing room only. Crowdfunding campaigns began popping up from Rwanda, Tanzania, and Cameroon, each promising decentralized micropower for villages. Behind all of it was a powerful narrative: Africa does not need to wait for permission to innovate. Meanwhile, Chikumbutso himself continued working, often quietly, often controversially, but consistently demonstrating one thing: energy innovation could be local, low-cost, and disruptive. By 2023, universities in Botswana, Nigeria, and Ethiopia had launched specialized research programs in low-voltage energy systems, experimental magnetics, and rural electrification models. Students who once dreamed only of working for European tech firms were now designing portable generators for their grandmother's village. What makes this movement so compelling is not just the inventions, but who is building them. Teenagers in garages, graduates in shared labs, farmers with workshop sheds. It is a decentralized renaissance powered by curiosity, necessity, and a refusal to settle for energy poverty. And while mainstream media barely covers it, global analytics firms are beginning to notice. Reports predict that Africa will become the fastest-growing market for off-grid energy solutions by 2030, surpassing regions that once led the clean tech race. Private energy companies are already losing customers as villages adopt hybrid community power models that don't require national grids at all. The world expected Africa to leapfrog landlines with cell phones. What they didn't expect is that Africa might leapfrog legacy power grids as well. Because once energy became a playground for experimentation, everything else followed. Water purification, cold storage, agricultural processing, even basic manufacturing, all began evolving around these new off-grid systems. In northern Uganda, entrepreneurs started using modified microgenerators to power groundwater pumps, giving entire farming communities reliable irrigation for the first time. In Zambia, lightweight battery-less cold rooms emerged, letting fishermen preserve their catch without diesel. In Senegal, Solar hybrid mills replaced manual grain processing, cutting labor time by 80% and increasing yield. These weren't theoretical pilot projects. These were working systems built by Africans for Africans. And as the hardware spread, so did the psychology. Innovators realized that if they could control power, they could control production. If they could control production, they could control profit. And for the first time, rural Africa didn't have to wait for electricity in order to participate in modern economics. Chikumbutso's influence wasn't that everyone was copying his designs. It was that he shattered a mental barrier. He showed that the laws of innovation were not written exclusively by Europe, America, or China. They could be rewritten in a backyard workshop in Harare. Even African governments, notorious for being late to tech shifts, began adjusting their strategy. Kenya expanded tax incentives for renewable components. Rwanda opened grant programs for energy mini-grids. Morocco launched cross-border clean tech incubators. Ethiopia subsidized domestic inverter manufacture. They weren't perfect policies, far from it, but they signaled something new: recognition. Recognition that energy independence could make Africa economically unshackled. Meanwhile, social media amplified the movement. TikTok and YouTube became the platforms where teenage inventors showcased everything from homemade turbines to ultra-efficient stove generators. Some videos hit millions of views, not because they were flashy, but because they were practical. But then something happened that nobody expected. Silicon Valley showed up. Venture funds that previously ignored the continent began sending scouts to Nairobi's iHub, to Kigali Innovation City, to Lagos tech clusters. Emails started coming in with subject lines like clean infrastructure, microgrid scalability, rural energy networks. They wanted to invest, not in charity but in innovation. And quietly, a few deals closed. One Nigerian startup secured funding to deploy modular rooftop power hubs. A Ghanaian company received investment for kinetic street lighting. A Tanzanian team partnered with MIT to develop modular rural grids using dirt-cheap components. What all of this revealed is that Africa's energy future may not look like America's or China's or Europe's. It may be smaller, distributed, hyper-efficient, and shockingly affordable, built not from trillion-dollar infrastructure, but from necessity-driven creativity. And at the emotional core of this renaissance, global media kept circling back to one question: how did this all begin? Time and time again, the story returned to an inventor whose prototypes, whether controversial, misunderstood, or extraordinary, forced the world to pay attention. Because once prototypes become products, and once products become infrastructure, the power dynamic changes. What was once seen as experimental African tinkering is starting to threaten established global industries. Take batteries, for example. Africa's energy innovators are increasingly embracing systems that don't rely on large lithium packs. They're exploring supercapacitors, mechanical storage, microhydro, and magnetically assisted systems, technologies that bypass the expensive, chemically messy supply chains dominated by China and the West. If that shift scales, the economic implications are massive. No more billion-dollar battery farms, no more mountains of e-waste, and no more endless dependency on imported cells. Utility companies are nervous too. Their entire business model relies on centralized grids, monthly billing, and monopoly control. But in rural Africa, decentralized microgrids are quietly proving that electricity doesn't need to come from a national grid at all. Small communities are becoming electrically self-sufficient, without waiting for government schedules or foreign contractors. In 2024, analysts at a European think tank quietly published a report predicting that Africa may become the first continent where microgrids outnumber national grid connections. The report barely made headlines, but inside boardrooms, it sent shockwaves. Because if Africa can build a modern energy economy without copying the West, then the Western model loses its global authority. That's where the tension begins. Multinationals are starting to lobby African governments to standardize and regulate innovation, coded language for slowing it down. Patent trolls are circling. Media outlets are launching fact-check campaigns that conveniently dismiss breakthrough prototypes while ignoring their real-world use cases. But here's the twist: Africa doesn't need permission anymore. The innovators driving this shift aren't waiting for validation from New York or Berlin. They're building for farmers, schools, clinics, off-grid workshops, and entire villages that have been ignored for 50 years. And when an invention solves a real problem in a real community, global approval stops mattering. That's why Phase 2 is dangerous for the old world. Because it exposes a truth that nobody expected. You don't need billion-dollar R&D centers to change the world. Sometimes you just need a soldering iron, a curious mind, and a reason to build. And sitting quietly at the heart of this energy revolution is the man who lit the match. Across Twitter, Reddit, and engineering forums, a new narrative started forming. If Chikumbutso proved one thing, it's that Africa isn't waiting for the world. Young innovators began mentioning his name not as a celebrity inventor, but as proof of concept that unconventional paths are valid. It wasn't admiration, it was fuel. So, when international universities began flying African students to clean tech conferences in Dubai and Singapore, the questions they were asked sounded different. Not why isn't Africa developing, but how did Africa get here so fast? The answer is layered, part necessity, part creativity, part rebellion, and part defiance against decades of being told that the continent was only a consumer, never a manufacturer. Phase 3 is the commercialization phase, where ideas stop being inspiring and start being profitable. This is the stage that Silicon Valley, Beijing, and Berlin quietly fear the most. Because once African innovations enter global markets, they stop being dismissed as local improvisations and start becoming direct competitors. And that's already beginning. A South African startup is exporting portable solar inverter kits to Southeast Asia. A Kenyan company that invented ultra-efficient cold storage boxes just signed a distribution deal in Brazil. A Nigerian microturbine manufacturer is negotiating with rural India. And a Ghanaian cleantech group is licensing its agricultural processing machines to the Caribbean. This is how global markets shift. Not with headlines, but with distribution agreements, licensing deals, and export contracts. Suddenly, Western companies are realizing something uncomfortable. Africa's innovations aren't just cheaper. They're simpler, lighter, more reparable, and often faster to deploy. They don't require teams of specialized engineers, complex supply chains, or million-dollar infrastructure. They're built for resilience, not perfection. And that makes them dangerous competitors. In 2025, an energy executive in Europe reportedly said during a private forum, "If these microsystems gain global traction, our grid business model is finished." That statement didn't make the news, but it did make investors nervous. Meanwhile, back in Africa, energy innovators aren't thinking about disruption or market share. They're thinking about powering homes, schools, wells, clinics, farms, and workshops. Global competition isn't their goal. Impact is. Yet impact has a funny way of becoming influence. Influence spreads into policy. Influence spreads into investment. Influence spreads into culture. And culture shapes the next generation. Which brings us to the final, often overlooked piece of this renaissance: inspiration. Workshops once filled with scrap electronics are now filled with students learning how to build converters, inverters, supercapacitors, low-voltage power systems, and renewable hybrids. This was unthinkable a decade ago. It's no coincidence that engineering enrollment numbers are rising across African universities while declining in Europe and the US. Africa's youth are watching a technological frontier unfold right in front of them, and they want to be part of it, not as spectators, but as contributors. And while governments, investors, and multinational corporations are only now waking up, the origin story remains rooted in something much simpler. One inventor proving, controversially, defiantly, and repeatedly, that energy innovation in Africa is possible. Whether one agrees with Chikumbutso's claims or not is irrelevant to the movement. What matters is that he broke the mental monopoly. He pushed open the door. He sparked a cultural shift that turned spectators into builders. So as Phase 3 begins and Africa's energy solutions quietly start entering the global economy, the world is asking a new question. What happens when a continent once defined by energy scarcity becomes a net exporter of energy solutions? Because when the world map changes, power shifts with it. If African-designed microgrids, kinetic generators, solar hybrids, and supercapacitor systems become global standards in rural electrification, emergency power, and low-cost industrial setups, then the geopolitical balance around energy begins to fracture. The countries that once dictated the rules of energy, through oil, through gas, through lithium, through patents, start losing their leverage. And that's exactly what energy analysts are beginning to whisper behind closed doors. Countries in the Gulf are already diversifying into clean tech partnerships with East Africa. India is exploring cross-licensing deals for microturbine patents. Brazil is negotiating African solar inverter supply chains to stabilize its Amazon region. And China, sensing opportunity, is courting startups in Nairobi and Lagos for manufacturing collaborations. This isn't charity. This isn't tech tourism. This is global positioning. Because if Africa can industrialize without waiting for grid expansion, if Africa can electrify remote regions without lithium mining, if Africa can manufacture low-cost power systems at scale, then Africa becomes not just a consumer market, but a supplier of solutions, a supplier of know-how, a supplier of new energy logic. At the center of this transition sits a broader cultural realization. Africa is no longer trying to catch up. Africa is building a separate path, a more modular path, a more accessible path, a more affordable path, one that doesn't rely on trillion-dollar infrastructure, international lenders, or centralized monopolies. One that grows from the ground up rather than the top down. And that brings us to a truth most policymakers aren't ready to confront. Energy is no longer just an engineering challenge, it's a sovereignty challenge. Who controls power, controls production. Who controls production, controls value. Who controls value, controls independence. For over 60 years, African nations have been told that industrialization requires foreign grids, foreign fuel, and foreign financing. But if a cheap 2 kilowatts microturbine can power a small village workshop, and a $300 solar inverter can run a clinic refrigerator, and a supercapacitor system can deliver instant startup for agricultural machines, then the entire colonial energy logic collapses. No wonder multinational energy giants are nervous. No wonder foreign consultants are writing risk briefings. No wonder think tanks are circulating internal memos. Because for the first time, Africa's energy future isn't being written in Washington, Paris, or Beijing. It's being written in Harare makerspaces, Nairobi tech hubs, Lagos garages, Lusaka workshops, Kigali innovation labs, and Cape Town manufacturing floors. And whether you view Chikumbutso as a genius, a disruptor, or a controversy, his impact is unmistakable. He made energy innovation aspirational. He made backyard engineering respectable. He made failure part of the process rather than the end of it. And perhaps most importantly, he made the next generation ask a question Africa was never taught to ask. What if we can build it ourselves? That question is now echoing from universities to workshops to investment rounds. And every time it gets asked, the renaissance accelerates. But there's one final stage to this revolution, one that will determine whether Africa remains a rising star or becomes a global power in energy technology. It's the manufacturing stage. The point where ideas stop being prototypes, stop being export deals, and start being factories with assembly lines, supply chains, logistics networks, and real industrial output. This is where every technology revolution either dies or conquers. African innovators know this. Investors know this. Governments are slowly catching up. Across the continent, industrial parks are being converted into clean tech zones. Robotics labs are being added to vocational schools. CNC machines, PCB printers, and battery assembly tools are popping up in places that never had them before. It's still early, still fragile, still uneven, but it's happening. Because Africa has finally realized that the only thing stronger than innovation is production. And as domestic manufacturing grows, so do the opportunities. Cheaper units for local markets. Customized designs for rural needs. Job creation for young engineers and technicians. Less dependency on foreign imports. More control over technological destiny. Meanwhile, the rest of the world is watching quietly, some with curiosity, some with anxiety, some with outright disbelief. But whether they understand it or not, Africa is entering a future that doesn't look like anyone else's. A future built on necessity-driven engineering, modular energy, micromanufacturing, and decentralized power. A future where the continent that once relied on foreign infrastructure becomes a global exporter of low-cost, high-impact energy solutions. And yet, through all of this growth, through all the headlines, debates, controversies, partnerships, and breakthroughs, one truth remains constant. This renaissance wasn't born in boardrooms, government offices, or billion-dollar labs. It began in workshops. It began in garages. It began with curiosity, scarcity, and stubborn belief. And whether you agree with his methods or not, the spark that helped ignite this new era came from a man who refused to wait for permission. Maxwell Chikumbutso didn't just inspire inventors, he forced Africa to reimagine itself. The movement that followed is bigger than him, bigger than any single inventor, and bigger than any single country. It's a generational shift, powered not by oil or lithium, but by imagination. And that's why this is just the beginning. Because revolutions don't start when everyone understands them. They start when one person refuses to accept the limits of what's possible.